Meet the forgotten tribe, the Curonians, who struck fear into even the Vikings. The screams of dying warriors echoed across the frozen Baltic shore as blood turned the pristine snow into a crimson battlefield. And for the first time in generations, the mighty Vikings knew the taste of true terror. They had sailed from the north with their dragon ships cutting through icy waters like blades through flesh, their axes thirsting for blood and their hearts burning with the promise of conquest. But on this cursed shore they encountered something that would haunt their nightmares for centuries to come. The Curonians, a tribe whose very name would be whispered in fear around Viking hearths, stood before them like demons risen from the depths of the Baltic Sea, their eyes reflecting a darkness that made even the bravest Norsemen question their gods. Ragnar Bloodaxe gripped his weapon tighter as he surveyed the beach where his longships had made landfall just hours before, now littered with the bodies of his finest warriors, their faces frozen in expressions of horror that spoke of deaths too terrible to imagine. The morning mist rolled in from the sea like ghostly fingers reaching for the living, and through that ethereal veil came sounds that no human throat should make, war cries that seemed to emerge from the very earth itself. His men, veterans of 100 raids who had faced Saxon shields and Frankish swords without flinching, now huddled together like frightened children, their eyes darting nervously toward the dark forest line where shadows moved with unnatural purpose. The Curonians were not like any enemy the Vikings had faced before, for they fought with a savagery that surpassed even the berserkers, and they possessed knowledge of dark arts that turned the very elements against their foes. Stories had reached Ragnar of this mysterious tribe that dwelt along the eastern Baltic shores, tales dismissed as the ravings of cowards and madmen. But now, as he stood amid the carnage of his decimated warband, he knew those stories had not told half the truth. These were not mere warriors defending their homeland. They were something far more ancient and terrible, guardians of secrets that predated the oldest Viking sagas. The raid had begun as countless others before it, with Viking longships emerging from the dawn mist like predatory beasts, their dragonheads promising death to all who opposed them. Ragnar had chosen this stretch of Curonian coast carefully, guided by captured traders who spoke of wealthy settlements ripe for plunder, their voices trembling as they mentioned the local inhabitants, but attributing their fear to Viking reputation rather than Curonian might. How wrong they had been, how catastrophically wrong, for the Curonians had been waiting, and their method of warfare defied everything the Vikings knew about combat. As Ragnar's ships approached the shore, the first sign of something amiss came from the behavior of the sea itself, which began to churn and writhe as if possessed by malevolent spirits. Waves that should have carried them smoothly to land instead seemed to grasp at their vessels with watery claws, pulling some ships off course and smashing them against hidden rocks that appeared from nowhere. The Vikings, master seafarers who could read wind and wave like sacred runes, found their skills useless against this unnatural tempest, and several longships were lost before they even reached the beach. Those who made it to shore found no peaceful fishing village awaiting their axes, but a nightmare landscape where the very sand seemed to shift beneath their feet, opening sinkholes that swallowed warriors whole. The Curonians attacked not as a conventional force, but as phantoms, appearing and disappearing in the mist, their weapons striking from impossible angles, their faces painted with symbols that hurt to look upon. They moved through the battlefield like dancers in some hellish performance, their bodies bending and twisting in ways that defied human anatomy, their speed supernatural. The Viking shield wall, that formation which had conquered kingdoms and broken armies, crumbled like sand before the Curonian assault. These mysterious warriors did not fight with honor as the Vikings understood it. They fought with calculated terror, using psychological warfare that broke minds before bodies. They would appear suddenly among the Viking ranks, not from the flanks or rear, but seemingly from the very ground, erupting from hidden tunnels and false graves they had prepared across their lands for just such invasions. Bjorn the Brave, Ragnar's most trusted lieutenant and a man who had stood against charging cavalry without yielding an inch, was among the first to fall to Curonian tactics. The warriors tell of how he was pulled beneath the earth while standing in full view of his comrades, his screams muffled by soil until only silence remained. And when they frantically dug where he had stood, they found nothing but his empty armor arranged in a mocking display. Such losses were not merely military defeats, but spiritual catastrophes that shook Viking confidence in their own gods and destiny. The Curonian warriors themselves were a sight that burned itself into Viking memory, their bodies decorated with intricate scarification that seemed to writhe and move in the flickering light of battle. Their hair woven with bones and teeth taken from enemies whose names were lost to time. They wore armor of a design never seen before, crafted from materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making them difficult to track in combat, their movements leaving after images that confused and disoriented their opponents. But it was not just their appearance that terrified, it was their complete silence in battle. For while Vikings roared and called upon their gods, the Curonians fought without uttering a sound, their mouths often sewn shut with sinew in some incomprehensible ritual. This unnatural quiet was more unnerving than any war cry, creating an atmosphere of dread that sapped Viking morale faster than any physical assault. The only sounds they made were with their weapons. And these were not the familiar clash of steel on steel, but strange harmonic vibrations that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those who heard them. As the battle raged, Ragnar witnessed horrors that would plague his dreams until his dying day, assuming he lived to see another sunset. He watched as his berserkers, those warriors who entered divine fury and felt no pain, suddenly stopped mid-charge and began clawing at their own faces, screaming about visions only they could see before turning their axes on their own shield brothers. The Curonians had somehow poisoned their minds, using combinations of toxic smoke and hypnotic patterns woven into their battle formations to drive enemies mad. The very landscape seemed allied with the Curonians, for the forests that bordered the beach came alive with hostile intent, trees groaning and reaching with branch-like appendages to snare fleeing Vikings, roots erupting from the ground to trip and entangle. Whether this was Curonian sorcery or simply intimate knowledge of their homeland's hidden dangers, the effect was the same: total tactical superiority that turned Viking strength into weakness. Ragnar tried to rally his men, calling upon the names of Thor and Odin, but his words seemed to die in the air, swallowed by an oppressive atmosphere that pressed down upon them like a physical weight. The sun itself seemed dimmed, casting everything in a sickly twilight that made it impossible to judge distance or time, and several Vikings later swore that they had been fighting for days, though only hours had passed, their perception of reality fundamentally altered by Curonian manipulation. The Curonian leader, if such a term could be applied to their seemingly anarchic command structure, was a figure that defied description, seeming to be sometimes man, sometimes woman, sometimes neither. Their form shifting and changing like smoke-given substance. This entity, for Ragnar could not think of it as merely human, moved through the battle with casual grace, gesturing languidly and watching with apparent disinterest as Vikings died in droves, occasionally making subtle movements that seemed to direct the flow of combat like a conductor leading an orchestra of death. When this being finally approached Ragnar directly, the Viking warlord felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Baltic wind, for looking into those eyes was like staring into an abyss that stared back with malevolent intelligence. The entity spoke, and its voice was not one but many, a chorus of the damned that seemed to emerge from every direction at once, speaking in a language that predated any Ragnar knew but which somehow conveyed meaning directly to his mind. The message was simple and terrible. The Vikings were not conquerors here, but sacrifices, their blood and souls fuel for rituals older than their gods. And their invasion had been not just expected, but orchestrated, lured by tales of wealth that were nothing more than bait for a trap centuries in the making. The Curonians were not defending their land so much as harvesting those who came to take it. And the Vikings were merely the latest in a long line of would-be conquerors who had fed the dark appetites of this cursed shore. As understanding dawned, Ragnar saw the true horror of their situation, for the dead Vikings were not merely killed but transformed, their bodies twitching and rising with jerky, unnatural movements to turn on their former comrades. But these were not the honored Draugr of Viking legend, warriors who returned to guard their treasures. These were hollow puppets animated by Curonian will, their faces slack and eyes empty as they mechanically struck down their former shield brothers with the same weapons they had carried in life. The psychological impact of fighting their own reanimated dead broke what little remained of Viking morale, and the ordered retreat Ragnar tried to organize became a chaotic rout. Men threw down weapons and shields in their desperation to reach the ships, trampling wounded comrades in their panic. all semblance of Viking discipline shattered by the sheer otherworldly horror of their situation. But even flight offered no salvation, for the Curonians had one final nightmare to unleash. As the surviving Vikings struggled to push their remaining longships back into the sea, the water itself rebelled against them, forming into shapes that resembled drowned sailors with seaweed hair and barnacle-encrusted flesh. These aquatic horrors pulled men from the ships, dragging them beneath the waves where their screams were reduced to bubbles, and those who witnessed their fate saw them transformed beneath the water into more of these creatures, immediately turning to attack their former comrades. The few ships that managed to escape the cursed shore carried back tales that would fundamentally alter Viking perception of the Baltic region. Where once they had seen only opportunities for raid and conquest, now they saw a boundary that should not be crossed, a realm where their gods held no power and where death was not the end but merely a transition to something worse. The Curonians had achieved what no force had before. They had taught the Vikings fear. In the great halls of Uppsala and Trondheim, skalds struggled to compose sagas of the Curonian encounter, but their verses faltered and died. For how could mortal words capture such cosmic horror? How could traditional kennings describe enemies who defied the very laws of nature and warfare? Some attempted to frame it as a test from the gods, a trial to strengthen Viking resolve, but those who had been there, who had seen comrades transformed into mockeries of life, knew better. Ragnar himself, once counted among the greatest Viking raiders, never fully recovered from the experience. He would sit for hours staring into fires, claiming to see Curonian faces in the flames, hearing their soundless battle cries in the wind. His hair, golden as harvest wheat when he had set sail, returned white as Baltic snow, and his eyes carried a haunted quality that made even hardened warriors uncomfortable. When pressed for details of what had occurred, he would only shake his head and mutter about things that should not be, about boundaries that should not be crossed. The economic impact was severe as well, for the Baltic trade routes that had enriched Viking merchants now carried a taint of fear. Ships gave the Curonian coast a wide berth, adding days to their journeys rather than risk even distant contact with those cursed shores. Goods that had once flowed freely became scarce and expensive, and several Viking settlements that had depended on Baltic trade withered and died, their populations fleeing inland rather than risk Curonian attention. But perhaps the most insidious effect was on Viking culture itself, for the encounter with the Curonians had introduced concepts that their worldview could not easily accommodate. The idea of enemies who used the dead as weapons, who fought without honor or comprehensible motivation, who seemed to exist outside the natural order. These thoughts poisoned the simple warrior ethos that had driven Viking expansion. Young warriors who once dreamed of dying gloriously in battle now wondered if death truly led to Valhalla, or if there were fates worse than any their skalds had imagined. Some Vikings, driven by a mixture of fear and fascination, attempted to study Curonian methods to understand the source of their terrible power. These investigations invariably ended in madness or disappearance, with the investigators either returning as babbling lunatics speaking of impossible geometries and equations written in human blood, or simply vanishing entirely, their fate unknown but easily imagined by those who had witnessed Curonian capabilities. The Christian missionaries who came to Viking lands in later years found unexpected allies in the survivors of Curonian encounters. Men who had seen powers that made them question everything they believed and who now sought comfort in a faith that promised protection from such cosmic horrors. The conversion of the Vikings, traditionally attributed to political and economic factors, may have owed more to Curonian terror than historians acknowledge. For when faced with enemies who commanded the dead and twisted reality itself, the promise of a powerful protector god became increasingly attractive. Among the Curonians themselves, the Viking raid was merely another verse in an epic that had been playing since before human memory. Their oral traditions, passed down through generations in languages that hurt the throat to speak, told of how they had come to their arrangement with the forces that dwelt beneath the Baltic waves and within the ancient forests. They were not conquerors of their land, but partners in a symbiotic relationship that required regular feeding. And the Vikings had simply been the latest offering to appetites that were never fully satisfied. The Curonian children grew up with bedtime stories that would drive Viking children mad with terror. Tales of the things that swam in the spaces between waves, of the trees that remembered when the world was young and humans were prey, of the bargains struck by their ancestors that bound their descendants in service to powers that existed outside conventional reality. To them, the Viking raid was not a military victory to celebrate, but a successful harvest. And they marked it not with monuments, but with strange rituals performed at sites that Vikings would have recognized as mass graves. The knowledge that the Curonians possessed, the source of their terrible abilities, was not written in any book or carved on any stone, for such physical media were too limiting for the concepts involved. Instead, it was encoded in scarification patterns that served as three-dimensional maps of higher realities, in dance movements that traced equations governing the intersection of life and death, in architectural arrangements that created zones where normal physics temporarily surrendered to older rules. Their warriors trained not in combat techniques as Vikings understood them, but in mental disciplines that allowed them to perceive and manipulate the quantum uncertainties that underlay apparent reality. What Vikings saw as supernatural speed was simply movement through folded space. What appeared as resurrection of the dead was manipulation of the temporal streams that separated is from was. And what seemed like mind control was merely the ability to perceive and adjust the chemical cascades that created consciousness. Yet for all their power, the Curonians were as much prisoners as masters of their situation. The entities they served, those vast intelligences that dwelt in dimensions tangential to human experience, demanded not just blood, but specific types of death, particular flavors of fear and despair that could only be harvested from warriors who believed themselves mighty. The Vikings, with their absolute confidence in their own strength and their god's protection, had provided a particularly rich feast, their terror all the more potent for being extracted from those who had never truly known it before. The Baltic Sea itself was different around Curonian lands, its waters containing trace elements unknown elsewhere, chemical signatures that suggested contamination from sources that predated the formation of the ocean itself. Fish caught in these waters exhibited mutations that defied biological classification, and sailors reported that compass needles spun wildly when approaching Curonian territories, as if the very magnetic fields of the Earth were twisted into non-Euclidean configurations. Weather patterns too showed anomalies centered on Curonian settlements, with storms that moved against prevailing winds, fogs that persisted regardless of temperature or humidity, and aurora-like displays that appeared even on moonless nights far from the polar regions. These phenomena were not random, but seemed to follow patterns that corresponded to Curonian ritual calendars, suggesting a level of environmental control that would not be scientifically explicable for centuries to come. The aftermath of the failed Viking raid rippled outward through Norse society in unexpected ways. Trade routes were reorganized to avoid not just Curonian lands, but areas that showed similar signs, regions where the locals were too quiet, where the old stories spoke of things better left undisturbed, where even animals seemed to avoid certain paths and clearings. A new form of Viking wisdom emerged, one that recognized that courage and strength had limits, that there were forces in the world against which no amount of valor could prevail. In the decades that followed, occasional Viking expeditions would probe the edges of Curonian territory, testing whether the stories had been exaggerated, whether new tactics or greater numbers might succeed where Ragnar had failed. These expeditions invariably ended in disaster, with the few survivors bringing back tales that only reinforced the original horror. The Curonians, it seemed, were not merely defending static positions, but actively expanding their influence, spreading their unnatural practices to neighboring tribes who chose service to cosmic horror over absorption by Viking expansion. The linguistic impact was notable as well, with Old Norse acquiring new words to describe concepts that had not previously required naming, terms for the animation of dead matter, for the folding of space, for the sensation of one's mind being read by inhuman intelligences. These entered Viking vocabulary as loanwords from languages that should not have been pronounceable by human tongues. Scholars who studied these linguistic borrowings often reported nightmares featuring the concepts the words described, as if the very sounds carried infectious meaning. Some Viking skalds, perhaps driven by artistic ambition or simple madness, attempted to compose epics that incorporated Curonian themes and imagery. These works, when performed, had disturbing effects on audiences, inducing mass hysteria, shared hallucinations, and in one documented case, the spontaneous death of every listener when the skald reached a particular passage describing Curonian battle techniques. The surviving manuscripts of these compositions were eventually burned by Christian authorities, though rumors persist of copies hidden in remote monasteries, waiting to release their mimetic poison on future generations. The question of how the Curonians had acquired their terrible knowledge remained a subject of fearful speculation among Viking philosophers and wise men. Some theories suggested contact with shipwrecked travelers from lands beyond the edge of the world, survivors of civilizations that had delved too deeply into forbidden knowledge and paid the price. Others believed the Curonians were not fully human at all, but hybrids resulting from congress between humans and the things that dwelt beneath the Baltic, their abilities inherited from inhuman ancestors. Archaeological evidence from later periods would support neither theory while suggesting something far stranger. That Curonian culture showed signs of temporal displacement, with artifacts and practices that seemed to reference events that had not yet occurred and technologies that would not be invented for centuries. It was as if they existed partially outside the normal flow of time, able to draw on knowledge and abilities from their own future or from alternate timelines where history had taken darker turns. The Viking concept of fate, the idea that all events were predetermined and that warriors should meet their destiny with courage, underwent significant revision after the Curonian encounters. If fate could include such horrors, if the Norns could weave such nightmares into the skein of existence, then perhaps fate itself was not the neutral force they had believed, but something actively malevolent, delighting in the suffering of those who thought themselves mighty. This philosophical crisis contributed to the eventual abandonment of traditional Viking religion, as warriors who had based their entire worldview on the promise of glorious death and eternal reward in Valhalla found themselves questioning whether their gods were powerful enough to protect them from the forces the Curonians served. The Christian God, with his promises of universal dominion and protection from demonic forces, seemed a safer bet than gods who had allowed their chosen warriors to be harvested like wheat by enemies who violated every natural law. The economic networks that had sustained Viking expansion never fully recovered from the Curonian shock. Trade routes that had to curve around forbidden territories were longer and more expensive, reducing profit margins and making some expeditions economically unviable. The need to maintain larger military escorts for merchant vessels, guards against not just conventional pirates, but against the possibility of Curonian expansion, further increased costs until many trading ventures simply ceased to be profitable. Maritime technology itself evolved in response to Curonian threats, with Viking shipbuilders incorporating design elements intended to protect against the specific horrors they had encountered. Ships were built with sealed compartments to prevent the water-based entities from spreading throughout the vessel, with religious symbols from multiple faiths carved into the wood in hopes that some combination might provide protection, with special chambers where crew could retreat if their comrades were transformed into enemies. The social structure of Viking society also adapted, with new roles emerging for those who specialized in detecting and countering Curonian influence. These individuals, part warrior and part mystic, developed techniques for identifying the subtle signs of Curonian presence, the barely perceptible wrongness that preceded their attacks, the environmental anomalies that marked their territory. Though their success rate was limited, the mere existence of such specialists provided psychological comfort to communities that feared Curonian expansion. Marriage customs changed as well, with new taboos emerging around unions with individuals from regions too close to Curonian territories. The fear that Curonian practices might be transmitted through bloodlines, that children might be born with inherited memories of cosmic horror or susceptibility to entity possession, led to careful genealogical record-keeping and the social isolation of families suspected of Curonian contact. These prejudices would persist for generations, creating social divisions that outlasted the specific threat that had spawned them. The artistic traditions of the Vikings, once focused on celebrating martial prowess and heroic deeds, began to incorporate themes of cosmic horror and existential dread that would have been foreign to earlier generations. Carved decorations on buildings and ships began to include protective symbols derived from half-understood Curonian imagery, attempts to fight fire with fire that sometimes had unexpected consequences when the symbols were too accurately reproduced. Even Viking funeral practices evolved in response to Curonian threats, with new rituals designed to ensure that the dead could not be repurposed as weapons. Bodies were burned with special herbs that supposedly prevented reanimation, buried with iron spikes through major joints to inhibit movement, or in extreme cases, dismembered and scattered to prevent reassembly. The traditional Viking funeral, with its emphasis on preparing the warrior for the afterlife journey, now included elements designed to keep them from returning to plague the living. The Curonians themselves seemed largely indifferent to the changes their existence had wrought in Viking society. continuing their mysterious practices without apparent concern for their growing reputation. Occasional diplomatic missions attempted to establish some form of communication or understanding, but these invariably failed, with ambassadors returning mentally shattered or not returning at all. The Curonians, it seemed, had no interest in conventional relations with neighboring peoples, viewing them solely through the lens of their cosmic obligations. As generations passed, the specific details of Ragnar's disastrous raid began to blur into legend, with each retelling adding new horrors or occasionally attempting to minimize the defeat to preserve Viking pride. But the core truth remained, that there were forces in the world that Viking courage could not overcome, enemies that fought with weapons beyond human understanding, and places where even the bravest warriors should fear to tread. The influence of the Curonian encounters extended far beyond the Baltic region, carried by traders and travelers to distant lands where the stories underwent further transformation. In the markets of Constantinople, Byzantine merchants spoke in whispers of the northern barbarians who had encountered something that made them flee in terror, while in the courts of Frankish kings, strategists incorporated the possibility of Curonian-type enemies into their military planning, developing contingencies for foes who might violate the established rules of warfare. The scholarly response was particularly interesting, as learned men across Europe attempted to fit the Curonian phenomena into existing frameworks of understanding. Christian theologians debated whether the Curonians represented a new form of demonic manifestation or were perhaps a surviving remnant of the Nephilim, those giants mentioned in Scripture who resulted from the union of angels and humans. Islamic scholars who heard the tales through trading networks wondered if the Curonians might be related to the jinn, beings of smokeless fire who existed in a realm parallel to but separate from human experience. Jewish mystics, with their complex understanding of divine names and the power of language, were particularly intrigued by reports of Curonian linguistic practices, the words that could reshape reality and the songs that could drive men mad. Some suggested that the Curonians had somehow acquired fragments of the divine language used in creation itself, giving them limited ability to speak new realities into existence. This theory led to several ill-fated expeditions by scholars seeking to learn these words of power, expeditions from which none returned. The medical knowledge of the era was also challenged by Curonian encounters, as healers struggled to treat wounds that defied conventional understanding. Injuries that appeared minor would suddenly worsen in patterns that suggested ongoing manipulation, while some warriors recovered from mortal wounds, only to exhibit profound personality changes that suggested their essential selves had been replaced or altered. New categories of affliction had to be created for conditions that had no precedent in traditional medicine. The legal systems of Viking society, based on concepts of honor, compensation, and reciprocal justice, found themselves inadequate when dealing with Curonian-related crimes. How could one seek weregild for a warrior who had been transformed into an enemy? How could property rights be established when the land itself might be compromised by Curonian influence? How could oaths be binding when one party might no longer be entirely human? New laws attempted to address these issues, creating a separate category of jurisprudence for matters touching on the supernatural. Even agriculture was affected, as farmers near the Baltic coast reported strange phenomena in their fields. Crops planted in soil that had been touched by Curonian influence grew in unnatural patterns, producing yields that were sometimes extraordinary but always somehow wrong. Grain that looked normal but induced madness when consumed. Vegetables that seemed to watch those who tended them. The knowledge of which fields were safe and which were tainted became crucial survival information passed down through farming families. The psychological techniques developed by Vikings to cope with Curonian trauma became an unexpected export, as other cultures facing their own existential threats sought methods for maintaining sanity in the face of cosmic horror. Meditation practices that focused on anchoring consciousness in immediate physical reality. Ritual behaviors that reinforced human identity against forces that sought to alter it. Social support structures designed to quickly identify and isolate those showing signs of entity influence. These innovations spread far beyond their origins. The children born to Vikings who had survived Curonian encounters often exhibited unusual traits, suggesting that exposure to Curonian energies could produce inheritable changes. Some showed extraordinary resistance to fear and pain, as if their parents' trauma had somehow inoculated them against normal human weaknesses. Others displayed disturbing abilities, knowing things they could not have learned, speaking occasionally in languages they had never heard, drawing symbols that matched Curonian designs despite having no possible exposure to them. These children formed a distinct subculture within Viking society, simultaneously valued for their unique capabilities and feared for what those capabilities might represent. Some became renowned warriors, their immunity to fear making them formidable in conventional battles. Others became seers and mystics, their altered perceptions allowing them to glimpse aspects of reality normally hidden from human awareness. But a significant number simply disappeared, walking into forests or sailing into seas from which they never returned, drawn by calls only they could hear. The maritime maps of the era began to include new symbols, markers not just for physical hazards like rocks and shoals, but for metaphysical dangers, areas where reality grew thin and Curonian influence might leak through. These maps became closely guarded treasures, their information crucial for safe navigation, but dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. The cartographers who created them often reported strange dreams after completing sections dealing with Curonian territories. Dreams of vast eyes opening in ocean depths and impossible cities existing in the spaces between map lines. Trade goods from regions near Curonian lands acquired a complex reputation, simultaneously desired for their exotic nature and feared for possible contamination. Amber from the Baltic shores, traditionally prized for its beauty and supposed magical properties, now carried associations with Curonian power, and pieces that showed unusual inclusions or colors were destroyed rather than sold. Furs from animals trapped near Curonian territories were said to carry whispers in their fur, voices that spoke when the pelts were stroked in certain patterns. The lumber from forests bordering Curonian regions was particularly problematic, as wood that appeared sound during harvesting might reveal disturbing properties during use. Buildings constructed with such timber reported phenomena ranging from the merely unsettling, such as walls that seemed to breathe or floors that creaked in rhythmic patterns, to the actively dangerous, such as rooms that changed dimensions when unobserved or doorways that occasionally opened onto landscapes that should not exist. The influence on Viking metalworking was subtle but significant, as smiths began incorporating new alloys and forging techniques designed to create weapons that might prove effective against Curonian foes. These weapons, marked with special runes and quenched in substances whose origins were best not questioned, became legendary for their effectiveness against conventional enemies, but showed disturbing tendencies to turn on their wielders when used against certain targets, as if the weapons themselves could distinguish between normal foes and those touched by cosmic horror. The evolution of Viking naval tactics in response to the Curonian threat produced innovations that would influence maritime warfare for centuries. The development of modular ship designs that could quickly separate into smaller units if part of the vessel was compromised. The use of sonic weapons intended to disrupt Curonian coordination. The practice of sailing in formations that created protective geometries based on half-understood Curonian principles. All these advances emerged from the desperate need to counter an enemy that fought outside conventional parameters. The religious implications continued to reverberate through Viking society as traditional practices adapted to incorporate protective elements against Curonian influence. The blot sacrifices now included specific rituals designed to strengthen the barriers between human and inhuman realms, while the sacred groves where Vikings worshipped acquired new defensive configurations, circles within circles that created zones of relative safety where Curonian powers were supposedly diminished. Some Viking priests, driven by desperation or ambition, attempted to form their own pacts with whatever forces the Curonians served, reasoning that if such powers could be allied with, they might be turned against their current servants. These attempts invariably ended in disaster, with the would-be negotiators found in states that suggested they had experienced every possible form of death simultaneously. Their bodies twisted into configurations that hurt to perceive and required immediate burning to prevent spreading effects. The seasonal festivals of Viking culture acquired new meanings in light of Curonian threats, with certain times of year identified as periods of increased danger when the barriers between realities grew thin. The winter solstice, traditionally a time of celebration and renewal, became a period of vigilance and protective rituals, while the summer solstice was marked by mass gatherings designed to create human energy fields that might repel inhuman intrusion. The oral traditions that preserved Viking history struggled to incorporate the Curonian encounters without themselves becoming vectors for mental contamination. Skalds developed elaborate metaphorical frameworks that allowed them to reference events without directly describing them, creating a rich vocabulary of allusion and implication that conveyed horror without triggering it. these linguistic innovations would influence Nordic poetry for generations, creating a tradition of indirect reference that scholars would later mistake for artistic sophistication rather than protective necessity. The impact on Viking gender relations was unexpected but significant, as the traditional division of martial and domestic roles broke down in the face of enemies who recognized no such distinctions. Women who had been excluded from raiding parties proved equally capable of detecting Curonian influence in daily life, and their traditional roles as guardians of household spiritual practice evolved to include active defense against metaphysical threats. The Volvas, female practitioners of Seder magic, found their skills suddenly essential for community survival, their ability to journey between worlds making them valuable scouts in the war against forces that existed partially outside normal reality. Children's games throughout Viking territories began to reflect Curonian influences, with new forms of play that unconsciously prepared young minds for encounters with impossible geometries and hostile entities, games that involved rapidly changing rules, players who switched identities without warning, and victory conditions that inverted expected outcomes became popular, creating generations of Vikings with increased mental flexibility and resistance to cognitive assault. The dietary practices of Vikings near Curonian territories underwent significant changes as certain foods were identified as increasing vulnerability to entity influence. Fish from specific waters were banned, while certain herbs and mushrooms previously used for their psychoactive properties were now avoided for fear of opening mental doorways better left closed. New dietary restrictions emerged based on combinations that seemed arbitrary, but were derived from hard-won experience about what mixtures of foods created states of consciousness vulnerable to Curonian manipulation. The architectural evolution of Viking settlements in response to Curonian threats produced structures that archaeologists would later find puzzling. Buildings designed with no right angles, doorways positioned according to mathematical principles that seemed to serve no practical purpose, windows placed to create sight lines that formed protective patterns when viewed from above. All these innovations reflected a desperate attempt to create human spaces that resisted inhuman intrusion. Even Viking concepts of time were affected, as encounters with Curonians suggested that linear temporal progression might be more flexible than previously believed. New words entered the language for experiences like remembering events that had not yet occurred, experiencing duration that did not match solar measurements, and the particularly disturbing sensation of existing in multiple moments simultaneously. Timekeeping devices were modified to include markers for temporal anomalies, and certain periods were designated as temporally unstable, times when normal activities should be suspended to avoid accidentally slipping between moments. The justice system's attempts to prosecute crimes involving Curonian influence created precedents that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity and responsibility. If a warrior committed atrocities while under entity control, who was responsible for compensation to the victims' families? If someone's personality was permanently altered by Curonian contact, were they legally the same person? These questions forced Viking legal scholars to develop increasingly sophisticated frameworks for understanding personhood and agency. The economic value of protection against Curonian influence created entire new industries, from the production of protective amulets whose effectiveness was measured in survival rates to the breeding of animals believed to sense entity presence. Professional guards specializing in metaphysical protection commanded premium prices, while insurance agreements began to include clauses specifically exempting damages caused by cosmic horror from coverage, forcing merchants to carefully evaluate the risks of different trade routes. The spread of literacy among Vikings, traditionally attributed to Christian influence, may have been accelerated by the need to record protective knowledge too dangerous to transmit orally. Written records allowed for the preservation of information about Curonian encounters without the risk of mental contamination that came from direct verbal transmission. The development of specialized scripts designed to convey information about supernatural threats without triggering those threats represented a significant advance in information technology. The migration patterns of Viking populations showed clear avoidance of areas associated with Curonian influence, creating demographic voids that persisted for centuries. Entire regions were abandoned, not because of military defeat or economic failure, but because of accumulating incidents that suggested Curonian attention. These abandoned areas became wild zones where normal humans feared to venture, creating gaps in the historical record that later scholars would struggle to explain. The influence on Viking medicine extended beyond trauma treatment to preventive practices designed to strengthen resistance to entity influence. dietary supplements derived from rare minerals found in meteorites, exercises designed to reinforce the boundary between self and other, meditative practices that anchored consciousness in physical reality, all became part of a holistic approach to maintaining human integrity in a universe that had revealed itself as fundamentally hostile to human existence. The transformation of Viking warrior culture in response to Curonian threats produced a new type of fighter, one trained not just in physical combat but in mental disciplines designed to maintain sanity when confronted with impossible realities. These warriors, known as the Mind Gods, underwent grueling preparations that included controlled exposure to diluted Curonian influences, building tolerance like one might to poison. Many did not survive the training, their minds shattered by even second-hand contact with cosmic horror. But those who emerged were humanity's best hope against the encroaching darkness. The strategic implications of Curonian existence forced Vikings to reconsider their entire approach to expansion and conquest. No longer could they simply identify wealthy targets and overwhelm them with superior military force. Now, every potential raid required extensive intelligence gathering about local spiritual practices, environmental anomalies, and historical incidents that might suggest Curonian influence or similar threats. The age of straightforward Viking raiding was ending, replaced by a more cautious approach that some traditional warriors viewed as cowardice but which survivors recognized as necessary wisdom. The Curonian method of warfare, if it could even be called that, seemed designed not merely to defeat enemies but to transform the very nature of conflict itself. Their battles were not discrete events with clear beginnings and endings, but ongoing processes that continued long after the physical fighting ceased. Veterans of Curonian encounters reported that the real battle began after returning home, as they struggled against memories that seemed to have a life of their own, trying to spread from mind to mind like a virulent infection. The economic model of Viking society, based on raiding and trading, began to shift towards more defensive strategies as the true cost of Curonian encounters became clear. The loss of experienced warriors was devastating enough, but the ongoing drain of resources required to monitor and contain Curonian influence threatened to bankrupt entire kingdoms. New forms of taxation emerged to fund protective measures, while traditional celebrations and feasts were curtailed to conserve resources for the invisible war being fought on metaphysical frontiers. The role of women in Viking society underwent dramatic changes as it became clear that Curonian threats did not respect traditional gender boundaries. Women proved equally capable of detecting subtle signs of entity influence, and their traditional responsibility for maintaining household spiritual practices evolved into active participation in community defense. Female warriors, previously rare, became more common as communities realized they needed every possible defender against enemies who attacked through dreams and shadows as readily as with physical weapons. The children of Curonian survivors formed a distinct generation marked by unique capabilities and disturbing knowledge. These young people grew up with an intuitive understanding of concepts that drove adults mad, casually discussing multiple dimensions and temporal paradoxes as if they were everyday matters. Some became invaluable assets in the ongoing struggle, their altered perceptions allowing them to detect threats invisible to normal humans. Others simply disappeared one day, walking into forests or sailing into mists from which they never returned, following calls only they could hear. The artistic expression of Viking culture transformed radically in response to Curonian encounters, developing new forms designed to convey horror without triggering it. Sculptors learned to suggest impossible geometries without actually creating them, while poets developed elaborate systems of metaphor that allowed them to reference cosmic horror obliquely. Music evolved particularly interesting adaptations, with certain combinations of notes identified as protective against entity influence while others were banned for their tendency to attract unwanted attention. The diplomatic relationships between Viking kingdoms became strained as different groups developed varying approaches to the Curonian threat. Some advocated for united action, pooling resources and knowledge to combat a common enemy. Others preferred isolation, hoping to avoid attention by minimizing contact with affected regions. A few radical factions even suggested attempting to negotiate with whatever forces the Curonians served, reasoning that submission might be preferable to the continued losses of the Shadow War. The technological development of Viking society accelerated in unexpected directions as craftsmen sought ways to counter Curonian advantages. New alloys were discovered that seemed to resist entity manipulation. Architectural techniques were developed that created spaces hostile to non-human consciousness. and agricultural methods emerged that produced food less susceptible to supernatural contamination. These innovations, born of desperate necessity, would lay groundwork for scientific advances that would not be formally understood for centuries. The psychological toll on Viking society manifested in rising rates of madness, suicide, and strange new forms of mental illness that healers struggled to categorize. Some victims retained their reasoning abilities but lost all emotional capacity, becoming hollow shells that went through the motions of life without any inner experience. Others developed overwhelming empathy that extended beyond humans to include objects and abstract concepts, leaving them paralyzed by the perceived suffering of stones and the loneliness of numbers. The concept of heroism itself underwent fundamental revision in Viking culture as traditional virtues proved inadequate against Curonian threats. Courage remained valued, but it was now tempered with wisdom about when to fight and when to flee. The berserker rage that had once been the ultimate expression of warrior spirit was now viewed with suspicion, as it created mental states vulnerable to entity possession. New heroes emerged who exemplified different virtues: the ability to maintain sanity under impossible pressure, the wisdom to recognize threats before they manifested, the strength to resist temptations that promised power at the cost of humanity. The religious evolution of Viking society accelerated as traditional gods proved ineffective against Curonian forces. Some communities abandoned the old ways entirely, embracing Christianity or other imported religions that promised protection from cosmic horror. Others attempted to synthesize traditional beliefs with new understanding, creating hybrid theologies that incorporated elements designed to address existential threats the original myths had never contemplated. A few groups went further, developing entirely new religious systems based on the principle that if hostile entities existed, then perhaps friendly ones did as well. Though attempts to contact such beings yielded results as disturbing as any Curonian encounter, the linguistic development of Old Norse accelerated dramatically as new concepts required new words, and certain old words acquired dangerous associations that required replacements. The language evolved defensive mechanisms, grammatical structures that resisted the encoding of harmful concepts, phonetic patterns that were difficult for non-human entities to reproduce. Children learned not just vocabulary and grammar, but also which combinations of words should never be spoken, which thoughts should never be fully articulated, which names should never be written down. The educational practices of Viking society transformed to prepare young people for a world that contained active hostility to human existence. Traditional skills like weapon training and navigation were supplemented with mental exercises designed to strengthen psychological defenses, recognition drills for identifying signs of entity influence, and carefully controlled exposure to diluted forms of cosmic horror to build resistance. The mortality rate in education increased dramatically, but those who survived were far better equipped to face the new realities of their world. The marriage customs and family structures of Viking society adapted to address Curonian-related concerns, with new forms of union designed to maximize psychological support while minimizing vulnerability to entity manipulation. Couples underwent compatibility testing that went beyond traditional concerns to evaluate their ability to anchor each other in consensus reality. Child-rearing practices incorporated protective rituals from conception onward, and families developed emergency protocols for situations where one member showed signs of entity influence. The role of elderly Vikings, traditionally valued for their wisdom and experience, became even more crucial as they represented repositories of knowledge about pre-Curonian times, their memories of a world that made sense, where enemies were merely human and death was merely death, served as psychological anchors for younger generations born into cosmic horror. Elaborate efforts were made to preserve their testimonies, though the process of recording such memories sometimes triggered delayed Curonian influences that had lain dormant for decades. The seasonal patterns of Viking life adapted to accommodate periods of increased Curonian activity, with certain times of year recognized as particularly dangerous for specific types of endeavor. Military campaigns were scheduled to avoid temporal confluences that might attract entity attention, while agricultural activities incorporated astronomical observations that had nothing to do with weather patterns and everything to do with dimensional stability. The calendar itself became a defensive tool, marking not just the passage of time but the ebb and flow of cosmic threats. The trade networks that connected Viking society to the wider world became vectors for both spreading warnings about Curonian threats and inadvertently transmitting their influence. Merchants developed elaborate protocols for quarantining goods from suspect regions, while certain trade routes were abandoned entirely despite their profitability. New forms of currency emerged that incorporated protective symbols, and commercial law evolved to address situations where one party to a contract might no longer be entirely human by the time of fulfillment. The military organization of Viking forces underwent complete restructuring to address Curonian-type threats, with traditional shield walls and berserker charges supplemented by units trained in detecting and countering supernatural influences. Command structures became more flexible to accommodate situations where normal chains of command might be compromised by entity possession or mental contamination. New forms of military communication were developed that could function even when verbal and visual contact became unreliable due to reality distortions. The architectural evolution continued as Viking builders developed increasingly sophisticated methods for creating human safe spaces in a hostile universe. Buildings were designed not just to shelter from weather and enemies, but to maintain dimensional stability and resist entity intrusion. The placement of settlements shifted from strategic military positions to locations identified as naturally resistant to Curonian influence, often sites that had been considered unlucky or cursed by previous generations, but which now revealed themselves as refuges from greater horrors. The cultural memory of Viking society developed elaborate mechanisms for preserving crucial information while preventing the spread of dangerous knowledge. Certain events were recorded in forms that could only be fully understood by those who had undergone specific preparatory training, while others were deliberately fragmented across multiple sources to prevent any single individual from possessing complete information about Curonian capabilities. The tradition of oral history evolved complex safeguards, with certain tales told only under specific circumstances designed to minimize the risk of triggering dormant influences. The economic specialization that emerged in response to Curonian threats created new social classes and professional roles that would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations. Entity hunters who tracked and eliminated human hosts for supernatural influences, reality anchors who maintained dimensional stability in populated areas, memory guardians who preserved safe versions of dangerous knowledge, all became recognized and vital professions. The traditional Viking emphasis on martial prowess expanded to include these new forms of warfare against threats that attacked through channels previous generations had not even known existed. The philosophical implications of Curonian existence continued to reverberate through Viking intellectual culture, forcing confrontations with questions that had no comfortable answers. If human consciousness could be so easily manipulated by external forces, what did that mean for concepts of free will and personal responsibility? If the dead could be weaponized against the living, what was the meaning of mortality? If reality itself was negotiable rather than fixed, how could any truth be established with certainty? These questions drove some of the greatest Viking thinkers to madness, while others developed philosophical systems of deliberate limitation, focusing only on what could be safely contemplated without risking one's sanity. The technological innovations spurred by Curonian threats began to accumulate into something resembling a scientific revolution, though one taking very different directions than later historians would recognize. Viking scholars developed mathematical systems for describing spaces with variable dimensions, chemical processes for creating materials that existed partially outside normal matter, and biological techniques for enhancing human resistance to entity influence. This knowledge was carefully guarded and transmitted only to those who had demonstrated both the intellectual capacity to understand it and the mental stability to survive the understanding. The social rituals of Viking culture evolved layers of protective meaning, with traditional celebrations and ceremonies acquiring new elements designed to reinforce community bonds against external threats. Feasts became opportunities not just for social bonding, but for collective reality reinforcement, with shared songs and stories that anchored participants in consensus experience. Wedding ceremonies incorporated vows not just to each other but to humanity itself, pledging to remain human regardless of external pressures. Even funeral rites adapted, focusing less on preparing the dead for the afterlife and more on ensuring they could not be turned against the living. The geographic knowledge of Viking navigators expanded to include not just physical locations but metaphysical ones, mapping areas where reality grew thin and passage between dimensions became possible. These maps, inscribed on materials that themselves seemed to exist partially outside normal space, became treasures more valuable than any gold, allowing safe passage through regions that would otherwise be death traps. The ability to read such maps required special training that changed the navigator's perception permanently, allowing them to see aspects of reality that normal humans could not perceive, but at the cost of never again being able to fully return to ignorant innocence. The dietary evolution of Viking culture in response to Curonian threats produced cuisine that would seem bizarre to modern palates, but which served specific protective functions. Combinations of foods that created chemical reactions in the body, increasing resistance to mental intrusion. Spices that, when consumed in specific sequences, seemed to make human consciousness less appetizing to entities. Fermented beverages that temporarily shifted perception just enough to detect but not succumb to supernatural influence. All became part of a culinary tradition focused on survival rather than pleasure. The musical traditions of Viking culture developed in fascinating directions as certain tones and rhythms were identified as either attractive or repulsive to entities. Musicians became warrior poets in the most literal sense, their performances serving as both entertainment and active defense against supernatural intrusion. New instruments were created specifically to produce sounds that human ears could barely perceive but which created zones of discomfort for non-human consciousness. The most skilled skalds learned to weave protective frequencies into their performances, creating audio barriers that supplemented physical defenses. The reproductive practices of Viking society adapted to address concerns about entity influence being transmitted to offspring, with new rituals surrounding conception, pregnancy, and birth designed to ensure fully human children. Midwives evolved into spiritual warriors, trained to detect and combat supernatural influences that might attempt to interfere with the birthing process. The first year of a child's life became a critical period of vigilance, with communities rallying to maintain protective watches over newborns who had not yet developed their own defenses against entity intrusion. The legal evolution continued as Viking law struggled to address crimes and conflicts involving supernatural elements, developing precedents that would influence Nordic jurisprudence for centuries. New categories of offense emerged, such as negligent exposure to entity influence, while traditional crimes acquired supernatural dimensions that complicated judgment and punishment. The concept of collective responsibility expanded to include not just kinship groups, but entire communities that might be contaminated by a single individual's poor choices regarding supernatural forces. The educational curriculum for young Vikings became increasingly complex as the skills needed for survival multiplied beyond traditional martial and domestic arts. Children learned to recognize the subtle signs of reality distortion, to perform mental exercises that reinforced their human identity, to create and maintain protective symbols that actually functioned rather than merely comforting. The high mortality rate among students was accepted as a necessary cost of preparing the next generation for a world that actively sought their destruction or transformation. The diplomatic protocols between Viking kingdoms evolved elaborate safeguards against supernatural contamination, with ambassadors undergoing quarantine periods and mental examination before and after missions. Treaties began to include clauses addressing mutual defense against entity threats and protocols for handling situations where one signatory might become compromised by supernatural influence. The concept of sovereignty itself evolved to include not just territorial integrity, but dimensional stability, with borders defined as much by metaphysical barriers as geographical features. The economic theory of Viking society developed new models to account for resources that existed partially outside normal reality, currencies that could be affected by observation, and markets that operated according to non-Euclidean principles. Trade agreements had to account for goods that might change nature during transport, services that could only be performed by individuals meeting specific mental criteria, and forms of payment that existed in potential rather than actuality until the moment of transaction. The military technology continued to evolve in response to Curonian threats, producing weapons that operated on principles that would not be formally understood by science for centuries, blades forged in ways that made them partially exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, allowing them to cut entities that had no purely physical form, armor designed not just to protect the body, but to shield the mind, incorporating materials and patterns that created zones of cognitive dissonance uncomfortable for non-human consciousness. Siege engines that projected not just physical projectiles but conceptual attacks, attempting to impose human order on spaces dominated by alien logic. The cultural production of Viking society, from epic poems to carved runestones, began to serve dual purposes as both artistic expression and practical defense against supernatural threats. Every creative work became a statement of human defiance against forces that sought to reduce humanity to resources or puppets. The most celebrated artists were those who could create beauty that actually repelled ugliness, order that actively resisted chaos, meaning that stood firm against the meaningless hunger of the entities the Curonians served. The religious synthesis that emerged from the collision between traditional Viking beliefs and Curonian reality produced some of the most innovative theology in human history. Though much of it was too dangerous to preserve in complete form, gods were reconceptualized not as supreme beings but as humanity's allies in a cosmic war against forces that predated and would outlast any pantheon. Prayer became less about requesting favor and more about reinforcing the barriers between human and inhuman realms. Sacred sites were chosen not for their historical significance but for their dimensional stability, places where human consciousness could gather strength for the ongoing struggle. The impact on Viking exploration was profound, as the discovery of new lands now carried the risk of encountering new forms of cosmic horror. Expeditions had to be planned not just for physical dangers but for metaphysical ones, with crews selected as much for their mental resilience as their sailing skills. The discovery of Vinland and other Western lands took on new significance as potential refuges from European supernatural threats, though explorers soon discovered that the New World had its own indigenous horrors that made Curonians seem almost comprehensible by comparison. The transformation of Viking society in response to Curonian threats represented one of the most rapid and comprehensive cultural evolutions in human history, though one largely hidden from conventional historical narratives. In the span of just a few generations, a culture based on straightforward martial values and simple cosmology evolved complex defenses against existential threats that challenged every assumption about reality. The Vikings who emerged from this crucible were very different from their ancestors, scarred by knowledge that could not be unlearned but strengthened by survival against odds that should have been impossible. Yet even as Viking society adapted and evolved, the Curonians themselves remained largely unchanged, continuing their ancient practices with the patience of those who measure time in geological rather than human scales. They had survived the rise and fall of civilizations that made the Vikings seem young, had made their bargains with forces that existed before the earth cooled, and would likely continue long after the last Viking bloodline failed. They were not conquerors in any human sense but gardeners tending a crop that renewed itself with each generation of would-be invaders. The legacy of the Viking-Curonian encounters would echo through history in ways both obvious and subtle, influencing the development of Northern European culture in directions that historians would struggle to explain without acknowledging the supernatural elements their training taught them to dismiss. The eventual Christianization of Scandinavia owed as much to the need for divine protection against cosmic horror as to any political or economic factors. The Viking diaspora that spread across Europe carried with it not just raiders and traders but refugees fleeing threats that made conventional warfare seem comfortingly simple. In the end, the story of Viking encounters with the Curonians was not one of simple military defeat but of fundamental transformation. The Vikings had set out to raid and conquer, driven by greed and glory, but they discovered something that changed them at the deepest level. They learned that humanity's position in the cosmos was far more precarious than they had imagined, that courage and strength alone were insufficient against certain threats, and that survival sometimes required evolving beyond what they had been. The Curonians, for their part, seemed to view the entire encounter as merely another verse in an endless song, another turn in a dance that had been choreographed before human consciousness emerged and would continue after it ended. They had performed their role perfectly, harvesting the fear and transformation that their patrons required, maintaining the balance between dimensions that kept even worse things at bay. The Vikings had been tools in this process, their invasion serving purposes they could never fully understand, their terror and adaptation part of patterns too vast for human minds to grasp. As the centuries passed and the Viking Age gave way to new eras, the specific details of Curonian encounters faded into legend and nightmare. But the changes they had wrought in human consciousness remained, transmitted through genetics and culture, story and song, preparing humanity for future encounters with forces that existed outside conventional reality. The Vikings had paid a terrible price for this knowledge, but that price may have purchased humanity's survival in a universe far stranger and more hostile than anyone had imagined. The Baltic Sea still washes against Curonian shores, its waters carrying memories of battles that violated the laws of nature and sacrifices that fed appetites beyond human understanding. Sometimes, on nights when the aurora borealis displays patterns that hurt to perceive, fishermen report seeing Viking longships sailing through the mists, their crews standing at eternal watch. forever guarding against something rising from the depths, whether these are ghosts, echoes, or something else entirely. None can say. But wise sailors give them wide berth and whisper prayers to whatever powers might be listening. The Curonians themselves remain in their ancestral lands, though their numbers have dwindled and their practices have adapted to a world that no longer sends Viking raiders to harvest. They maintain their vigil and their bargains, knowing that the cosmos contains threats that make their historical reputation seem almost quaint. They are humanity's monsters, but they are our monsters, standing between us and things that have no name in any human language. Things that view the distinction between Viking and Curonian as meaningless as the distinction between two grains of sand. In the great halls of Valhalla, if such a place exists, the Vikings who fell to Curonian forces are said to feast apart from other warriors, their experiences having marked them as different even in death. They do not speak of their battles, for some victories are too terrible to celebrate, and some defeats too cosmic to mourn. They wait, these scarred souls, for a final battle that may never come, or may have already happened in a future that bleeds backward into the past. Time itself being just another battlefield where human linear perception struggles against forces that exist in all moments simultaneously. The world has moved on from the age of Vikings and Curonians, but the lessons learned in those terrible encounters remain encoded in our cultures, our languages, our very genes. We build our cities in patterns that unconsciously repel certain geometries. We tell our children stories that prepare them for wonders and terrors their conscious minds don't believe in. We maintain traditions whose original purposes are forgotten but whose protective functions continue. The Viking-Curonian wars may be over, but the conflict they represented between human consciousness and the vast, indifferent cosmos continues in forms we don't always recognize. This, then, is the tale of how the Vikings, masters of the medieval world, met their match in the Curonians, a forgotten tribe that served forces beyond human comprehension. It is a story of courage and horror, transformation and survival, of humanity's struggle to maintain its identity in a universe that views that identity as, at best, a temporary arrangement. The Vikings sought gold and glory but found instead a darkness that changed them forever. And in that change, perhaps, lies the seed of humanity's eventual salvation or its ultimate doom.